Alrighty, in this video, we're going to see how we can import CSS with Browserify using the Browserify CSS transform. So we're going to use this to pull in the jQuery UI CSS. And the reason I'm kind of wanting to show you guys how to do this, as opposed to pulling in the CSS and bundling the CSS in an external task, is because we're going to run into it's sort of interesting thing to kind of work around and kind of think about when we use these bundlers. It's going to be something very similar that we're going to be working with when we take a look at Webpack. So I decided to show you guys this example and walk you guys through it. It's mostly based off of what you can see on the documentation on this page, and I really try not to just read documentation verbatim to you guys, but I thought it was an interesting enough discussion to include here, so that's what we're going to be doing. All right, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I'm going to do is hop over into our command line window, and I'm going to install the Browserify CSS transform. And again, what it's going to do is it's going to allow us within our JavaScript files to include CSS, and that CSS will then be included in our bundle and added to our page. So I'm simply going to do npm install, and then I'm going to pass in Browserify CSS, and I'm going to save dev that. So we have that working. So that's all awesome. Kind of taking a couple more seconds than I thought it would. But we are good to go. Okay, so now that we have that going, let's hop over into our Gulp file and let's use it. So just like what I did with Babelify, in fact, maybe I'll add it right next to Babelify because this is also a Browserify transform. I'm going to say Browserify CSS equals require Browserify CSS. And then to use it, all I have to do is say bundler.transform Browserify CSS, and from here I can pass an option. Now, I'm not going to worry about any of the options that I'm going to be passing in here quite yet. I just want to show you guys what will happen by just adding the Browserify CSS, but I'm leaving this dummy object here as a placeholder. See, so let's see what happens. If I went and ran our Gulp or dev scripts right now, nothing will change. But what I'm going to do here is actually add an import statement for a CSS file. So I'm going to hop into my source scripts application.js, and then wherever I want, maybe I'll put stuff relating to what theme I want to use here at the top of application.js. I'm simply going to say import jQuery-UI themes. Let's do UI darkness, and then jQuery-UI.css. Okay, whoops. That's what I get for talking and typing at the same time. Okay, so that'll reach into the jQuery UI module, which is under my Node modules. So if I actually scroll all the way down to jQuery UI, wherever that guy ran off to, jQuery UI, we have the module here, and then I'm reaching into the themes folder, then reaching into UI darkness, and then I'm grabbing jQuery UI CSS. So it's not magic. This is just locating the jQuery UI module in our Node modules folder and then reaching into that for a specific file. You could certainly import individual jQuery UI files if you want to, as opposed to pulling them all in with just importing jQuery UI. But we talked about that a while ago when we talked about how Node imports work. Anyway, now that we have that done, let's come over here and say gulp dev scripts and hit enter. All right, so we have an error here already. So basically what it's telling us is that we have parse error unexpected token. And the reason for that is that our Browserify CSS transform is not being applied to things that come out of Node modules. Now, this is an interesting behavior of Browserify and the respective transforms. That's actually incredibly important. We don't want Browserify to run transforms against most of the stuff we have in Node modules. We don't want to run it through Babel because anything you grab off of NPM should already be compiled into JavaScript. So because it's not being ran globally, we have to actually go in and tell it to. So we have to jump into the Gulp file and give it an option. And that option is, not surprisingly, global is true. So now that we have that, I can say gulp dev scripts, and we should receive success. And we do. So now if I hop into, let's say, our public build bundle.js, and I searched for, I don't know, UI-dialog or something, eventually I should run into some CSS. And here it is. So our CSS file that I imported got stuck directly into the into the bundle. And when we load it, it's going to get added to our DOM as a style element. So let's go ahead and pop open our page, come over here and refresh, and see if we got our jQuery UI styles. Now, if I click on this, we see that we do get our jQuery UI styles. So that's pretty awesome, but we have a problem. And the problem becomes apparent when I hit F12 and hit refresh, and then open this up, and notice I'm getting a bunch of these 404s. So what's going on here? Well, this is kind of the topic I really wanted to discuss when it comes to using Browserify, and that is when you start doing things like loading in CSS files, it's not going to automatically do things like rewrite the paths for images or fonts or what have you. So as you see right here, we're trying to reach into our node modules folder, but the problem with that is our node modules folder isn't being served out on the web server, nor should it ever be served out in the web server. So how do you fix that? How do you go about getting our images that we reference in the CSS files to be ported over into a file that we can then use? Well, turns out that that's pretty, well, I wouldn't necessarily say straightforward, but it is something that the authors of Browserify CSS gave us a hook to work with. So let's go ahead and pop open our Gulp file.js, and let's add some more configuration options here. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to give it a configuration option of the root directory, which I'm going to mark as public. So we're saying the public folder is what's going to be served out. Next up, I'm going to provide a function. I'm going to say process relative URL, and I'm just going to use this syntax here to make it a little bit more straightforward and obvious that it's a function. I could have used the two other syntaxes, either error functions, or I could have used just a straight-up function like that as well, more ES 2015 syntax. But anyway, the process relative URL function basically says, all right, guys, we found you in your CSS file, you're referencing an image or a font or something external. How do we go about transforming that reference into something that we can serve out? So I'm going to take in a relative path parameter here. And just for now, I'm going to go ahead and do two things. I'm going to console log it out, and then I'm just going to return it. So the process relative URL expects us to rewrite this relative path and then return it back. I'm just going to console log it out just to show you guys that it's working. And now you can see that what we get are all of these paths. So it's showing these paths relative to what we specified the root directory as. Like, for example, if I took that out, that root directory, notice how it is doing things relative to the CSS files themselves, which isn't really what I want. That's going to be really difficult to work with. So I'm kind of anchoring it in the public directory. So now I can work with it in a better way. But anyway, so let's go ahead and fix this. So I'm going to delete that. Now I am going to pull down a new module. I'm going to go ahead and pull down npm install, and it's going to be fs-extra save dev. The fs-extra package is this neat little package that makes doing certain things like copying files a little easier. Because again, what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to take these files in our node modules directory and copy them into our public directory. So I can go ahead and install the fs-extra, which we're going to use to do just that. And I'm going to go ahead and jump up at the top because there's a handful of additional packages we're going to need in order to write this code. This code isn't necessarily that trivial, and this is all code based off what you can read up on the documentation. But again, I wanted to walk you guys through it a little bit because working with paths like this can kind of be a pain sometimes, and I want you guys to understand what's going on. So I'm going to do fse equals require fs-extra. And then I'm going to pull in path equals require path. Of course, the path is a built-in node module for dealing with paths. And then I'm also going to require in Lodash. Now, we already have Lodash installed in our node modules because we needed it for our front end. Okay, so for process relative URL, I'm going to start off with a couple of variables at the top. I'm going to say constant root directory is going to be path.resolve process cwd followed by public. So now if I console log out rootdir, followed by relative path, well actually I'll just, to make this easier, I'll console log out an array of rootdir and relative path. You can kind of see what's going on. Whoops. Kind of see what's going on here. So process.cwd is going to be our current working directory. So you see our root directory is now anchored into it's now a relative, or sorry, an absolute path right into our public folder, which is cool. Okay, so now we have root dir. I'm going to go ahead and create a prefix. Now the prefix is going to be used to kind of detect if we're in a node modules or not. Now I'm not going to do .. node modules. That's what they do in the documentation. This isn't going to work on Windows, because if we take a look at the paths that are being passed into us, we're getting ... and then a backslash, because again, we are on Windows. Well, at least I'm on Windows, you guys might not be. So whenever we're working with paths, and they need to match our backslashes and forward slashes depending on what operating system we're running on, we're going to use the path module to join these. So I'm going to say path join, and I'm going to join ... with node modules. And that's going to result in our prefix being the having the proper slash in it. Okay, so now we have a prefix. So then I'm going to say, if not, lodash dot starts with relative path prefix, then continue. And so we're saying, or sorry, not continue, return relative path. So we're saying, because we're not in a loop or in a function. Anyway, so we're saying that if this file does not exist inside of our node modules, then we're not going to do any further processing. We don't need to do any further processing because it's most likely in a public directory anyway. Now, we could certainly come in here, and if we wanted to work with files behind our source directory, we could add another check in here to see, okay, is it in node modules, or is it in source, or whatever. You can obviously expand this function to whatever you need it to do. But right now, we're only concerned about pulling image files and CSS files out of our node modules. So now I have to get a path to where I want these images to be located in relative to the root URL of the application. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to say const vendor path, or I could say vendor URL to make it clear that we're working here with a URL and not a path, equals vendor slash, or we could do / vendor as well. That should work. Plus relative path dot substring prefix dot length. So basically, we are chopping off this prefix here. We're chopping off this node modules and then appending on a vendor. So yeah, stuff and things. So that's our vendor URL. Now we need to go ahead and get the absolute path to our source file and the absolute path to our destination file. So I'm going to say const source file equals path.join root directory, and then our relative path. Remember, our relative path is the path relative to this directory. And then we're going to say const dest file equals path.join our root directory with our vendor path. And now we simply copy it. So I'm going to say console log, and I'm going to say source file, and then I'm going to say arrow dest file. So we can kind of get an idea of what files are being copied, and then we can actually perform the copy. So I'm going to say fse.copy sync, and then I'm going to pass in source file and dest file. Then I'm going to return vendor path. Because remember, I'm returning, or vendor URL, I'm returning the end URL of this whole process. So now if I come over here and say gulp dev scripts, hopefully we won't get an error. And doesn't seem like we are. So now if I hop over into my public, we should now have a vendor folder. And in vendor, we have our jQuery UI. And notice how the directory structure is not flattened. So that's a really important thing here, so that if we have multiple images with the same name, but in different directories, it doesn't get flattened like that. Anyway, so let's hop back over into Chrome and do a refresh and see that we did indeed get our images. So yeah, I'm not going to say, you know, I love saying this is pretty straightforward all the time. In this case, it's not pretty straightforward. It's kind of a pain because we're thinking about all these different paths and what they're relative to. But it's a good exercise when talking about the file system and how to work with things. And it's also important to understand how we can pull out assets from node modules. Because if you use Browserify, you're mostly going to be working with node modules and the npm package manager. But yeah, I think that's all I wanted to talk about in regards to CSS. So we still have a couple other things to talk about here. We still have to talk about watching and production builds and code splitting, but I think we're going to do that in the next few videos. So we'll see you guys then.